If for some reason you can't do the sign-in sheet, if you're joining from a phone or just are unable to get into it for some reason, feel free to direct message either Bridget or I in the chat and just tell us your name, what agency you're coming from, if you work for a member agency, and what your role is at the member agency. If you don't work for an agency, feel free to just tell us your name and where you're coming from.
Are you going to do that?
I got a couple messages, so I'll jot down people's info.
Yes, and for anyone wondering, we are recording today and we'll send out the recording potentially by the end of this week, if not early next week. You'll get a follow-up email that'll have the link to the recording.
All right, it's 1:03. Kelsey, would you like to get us, or should we get started?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, awesome. So thank you all so much for joining us today for our third and final program for the Summer Institute. I'm sure hopefully you've been in our other programs by now, but if not, or if you forgot which of us is which, I'm Bridget Kessner. I am the Education and Youth Services Coordinator here at the Alliance. And I'm really eager to dive into today's presentation. Kelsey, would you like to introduce yourself quick?
Yeah. I'm Kelsey Alexander. I'm the Training and Prevention Coordinator at the Alliance, and I'm so happy to have you all here for our final part of the series.
Great. So just a little bit of housekeeping. Just a reminder to please keep your mics muted unless you are jumping on mic to ask a question or participate in a breakout room or something of that nature, just to ensure we don't have background noise for everybody on the program. Today's program, as I'm sure you got the notification, will be recorded, so you will have that for access later, but we just want to be mindful to let folks know in case they do want to keep their cameras on or participate in any conversation today. I will put it in the chat one more time right now and again at the end, but we do have a virtual sign-in sheet that we'll ask you to please complete so that we know who is present with us today, and so that we can ensure that those of you who have attended all three programs do receive your certificate of participation. So with all of that in mind, welcome back. We want to just remind you all to take care of yourselves. I know we have prefaced all three of our presentations with it, but it is worth repeating. The topic of child sexual abuse, even when we're talking about prevention and potentially some empowering techniques in prevention, can be an extremely difficult topic for folks to talk about, whether it is, of course, impacting their professional lives, has had some impact on their personal life, or it's, even for anybody, just a difficult conversation to be having and a difficult presentation to be attending potentially. So with that in mind, I encourage you to do what I've encouraged you to do at all of our other sessions, and just write down something that you are going to do to take care of yourself upon the conclusion of today's program. Just a little jotting something down in the margins. Personally, I am going to take a very nice long walk with my dog, given that it is about to rain and the next couple days, and he does not like the rain, so I want to make sure he gets his exercise and I get mine. So that is what I wrote in the margin, is my dog's name. But I encourage you all just to write something down to commit to doing for your self-care after today's program. Additionally, if you do need to process anything, if you have any concerns about, anything you heard today, if you need someone to just process something with, Kelsey and I will be the last one on today's program. If you do need to talk, we want to ensure that we're making space for all of you at that time, if you need it. So with that in mind, we're already going to jump into a bit of a discussion here. So as you may remember, you got a follow-up email after our last presentation with a little bit of homework that you've had for the last month or so. So hopefully a few of you have gotten a chance to kind of check that over and give it some thought. So we had a hypothetical here that we wanted folks to process, saying an adult costumer at a local children's theater program notices that the adult male tech director keeps walking through the girls' dressing room to get materials from a back closet. This is happening even though the dressing room is occupied by the girls, and he has currently stopped to have a conversation with one of them. So of course, if anybody wants to jump in and just share either in the chat or on mic, what is problematic about the actions of this adult, the tech director?
So in the chat, we've got a male in a girl's dressing room. It's problematic that they're walking around in an area where children are changing their clothes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there may be, an understanding with the parents and children that the costumer may need to be present in that space, but it's likely none of those folks consented to, this other adult being present in that space, right? So definitely problematic. And, if anybody else would like to jump in, share anything. Definitely problematic as well, of course, that he has, stopped in this space to have a conversation, kind of perhaps normalizing his presence, right? And it's potentially problematic too, that this is something that likely, if he's getting something from that back closet, is something that can be done by someone else or done, be done at a different time. So as the adult costume designer, how would any of you intervene in this situation or advise that adult costumer to intervene?
I think it'd be appropriate to pull them aside, like ask to speak to them privately, and then, at least for the time being, because this situation sounds like something is like an event is going on. So at least for the time being, asking them if they can, stop going to the back closet for the time being, and then afterwards having a more involved conversation of like, it's inappropriate for you to be back there while the kids are changing.
Yep, I think that's absolutely perfect. Definitely if, there's any pushback, if he's just talking about how he just needs to get stuff, just offering perhaps to get it until you can have that further conversation. Again, and recognizing, like you said, in that environment, folks may be pressed for time. It may be a bit of a chaotic one. So just kind of saving a more substantial conversation for later, definitely. Are there any other ways that folks might step into that conversation, or anything else they might say to that adult? Maybe in that later conversation. Explain the inappropriateness. Sure, they might not be thinking anything of it, right? But ensure that they understand that it's inappropriate.
Maybe also help them problem solve, because like I can imagine if they were actually unaware, they might feel like pretty embarrassed and maybe confused as to like how they're going to do their job. So help them problem solve, like where else can you keep those things that would prevent you from having to go into one of the kids' dressing rooms every time you need something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's super important, especially in considering you want to prevent this from happening in the future, right? So having that plan in place can really ensure that that happens. And if it's noted that boundaries are still being pushed, despite the fact that there's a solution, then that could be key, a red flag that there's a bigger problem at play here. Are there any other adults that you all think should be in the loop potentially about the situation? Other staff, sure. The program director, definitely. Director, theater director, yep. There's usually, you know, like a director, or producer, whoever is sort of in a position of power over that, you know, both parties. Yep, somebody to ensure that they're aware when the customer's not around or maybe otherwise occupied, absolutely. I think it is important that it's all communicated to somebody who might have, you know, that oversight in case there's been any other red flags to kind of put those pieces together. So all of this is definitely great feedback. And then lastly, are there any policies that you would, you know, consider putting in place to prevent these incidents? I got, excuse me, a direct message isn't heteronormative to assume that only a man would be possible an appropriate viewer of the girls, or am I just overthinking it? I think that that's definitely an important point to consider, that that would be the only appropriate viewer, because I think, and that's kind of why I stated at the beginning, you know, I think in a situation where you're in, you know, costuming situation backstage, right, it would be potentially assumed that there's a costumer providing some assistance, being present in that space. Ideally, in that policy, that's something that the adults are in the loop about, right? All the adults in that program and the adults of those children have an understanding that that adult will be present for that purpose. But I think regardless of who the party is that is coming in and out, and regardless of their gender, you know, that would be something that would be inappropriate, definitely. But I appreciate that feedback because I think, yeah, in any situation of any gender, it wouldn't be appropriate. Of course, only specified adults near the dressing room, right? Definitely, just the people that need to be there for a reason. Storage closet shouldn't be in children's dressing rooms. Agreed. Yep, conducting background checks to ensure, you know, that the people are checked. And there should be a policy if there isn't. Needed supplies from the closet should be obtained before or after the dressing room is being used. That'd be a great policy. If adults need to help, they have to have 2 adults there at the same time. Yes, that's great. I really appreciate that feedback and that you're all giving. Those are all great policies that could definitely prevent something like this from happening in the future or have prevented the situation at all. So we definitely appreciate that feedback. So thank you so much for sharing everything you had in mind and for kind of, you know, applying some of this to the hypothetical, the information we've been going over. So just a bit about today's objectives. As you can see here, we're going to increase understanding of best practices in primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention of child sexual abuse. We are going to increase understanding of the differentiation between outreach, awareness, and prevention programming. We'll be building capacity to identify characteristics of effective prevention programming and build awareness of the breadth of prevention opportunities beyond individual or family programming. So we have a lot to get started on today. And with that, I will hand it over to Kelsey to get us started.
Bridget. All right. I also just wanted to say about I like the theater example because many of us are involved in like different community spaces, or, you know, we have hobbies and other activities we do outside of work. And while I am not saying that you need to take your like anti-sexual violence hat with you in every space of your life and be like doing lots of work outside of your job because this work is hard enough from like 9 to 5 or whatever your hours are. I do think it's worth just being aware of like, yeah, there's policies that could be improved probably in many places that we find ourselves. So thinking about that when you've got the brain power and the emotional power to do it. All right, so we're going to do a little bit of what I'm guessing is a review for some of you about differences between primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Not because I think many of you haven't heard this before, but just because it is grounding our whole conversation today. So primary prevention in this is intentionally sort of like a pyramid structure here. And the base of this is primary prevention because ideally this is what we would be doing the most of if our goal is to really prevent child sexual abuse from happening, right? So primary prevention of any sort of problem are the activities and the approaches that we take before something has happened. So before anybody has experienced any violence, we engage in some sort of activity to make it less likely that they experience that form of violence or that they themselves like do that sort of violence to somebody else. So that's primary prevention. Secondary prevention is sort of our immediate response to somebody who has experienced some form of violence or who has done some form of violence. So this is a form of prevention, even though something has happened, because how we treat somebody or like the services we offer to someone who has just experienced this can make it more or less likely that it happens again, right? So we're just trying to prevent it from happening again. And then tertiary prevention is really more about dealing with like long-term consequences. So a person experienced child sexual abuse when they were young. They may be an adult now, but they may be continuing to get counseling or whatever other support they need. And this is, again, sort of similar to secondary prevention in that somebody having like long-term success and long-term, preventing being re-victimized or experiencing this violence again or harming somebody else can hinge upon like what sort of support do they get both in the short term and in the long term, right? So all of these are things that do prevent child sexual abuse. We sort of, when we think about prevention, we want to be really focused on primary prevention because that's our goal, is that just we have fewer people that experience violence, right? So if you think about, and feel free to put an answer in the chat or to unmute yourself, if you think about what our member centers are currently doing, like all of the services that we are offering, how would you categorize some of those services? Are they primary prevention? Are they secondary prevention? Are they tertiary prevention? What are we currently offering? What are we currently doing? If you work for an institution or a youth serving agency that is not one of our member centers, if your agency is doing something that falls into one of these categories, let us know what that is. So I see we've got all
These are my
three.
regular glasses. Oh, but they
Makes sense. I agree. We have in all three, or in theory, all three. We've got prevention. Education is mostly primary prevention, but we certainly run into secondary when children disclose to us. From the Rowan Center, we've got prevention education is primary, and then crisis counseling would be secondary prevention. Absolutely. Okay. So we can see that all the activities that our agencies are offering probably fall into one of these categories, right? All right, so the next thing that we're going to go over, and again, this might be a little bit of a review for some folks, is the differences between outreach programming or outreach generally, it's not always programming, awareness and prevention. Because I think we sometimes use the word prevention to speak about like a whole group of things, like a bunch of different types of activities that are not actually all prevention. So we'll get to prevention in a second. We'll just start at the top here. So first we're going to talk about outreach. All right. So the way that I've broken this down is sort of there's a definition and then there's essential questions. So if the activity you're doing is answering one of those questions, that's sort of how you would know what category to put it in. And we're going to do a few poll questions in a second to sort of test our knowledge of this. So outreach is when we are connecting potential survivors or victims to resources. We want to make sure that the general public, service providers, anybody who might be working with potential victims or survivors, they know that our member centers exist, that there's all of these anti-sexual violence resources available to them in the community, right? So the question that we might be asking is, do people in my community know where they could go if they or a loved one experienced child sexual abuse, right? And if we're doing something that leads people to say, oh, yep, now I know about YWCA's sexual assault crisis program, or now I know about the Rowan Center and the free services they offer, right? That may be an outreach activity. These are not like hard and fast categories here. You'll see like some blurring of lines, but generally outreach is just, do people know about us? Awareness is a little bit more focused on the actual problem, right? Rather than the services we offer, it's more about what is the actual issue. So in the case of child sexual abuse, awareness programming means we want the public to know about the existence of child sexual abuse, what it looks like, sort of who does it affect, how big of a problem is it? A lot of the statistics that we, offer or talk about like fall into this awareness programming. So the questions we might be asking are, do people know what child sexual abuse is? And is their understanding accurate? So sometimes when people have misunderstandings about like who harms children in this way, or what populations of children are most at risk, we're correcting those misperceptions, right? That's part of awareness programming. And do they know who it affects and how prevalent it is? All right, so that's what awareness does. Prevention programming are literally activities that lead to fewer children experiencing sexual abuse. So the reason why these are 3 distinct categories and they're not all just under the umbrella of prevention is because while all 3 of them are important, it's important people know about our services, and it's important people have an accurate understanding of what child sexual abuse is and who it affects. Simply knowing about a problem does not necessarily make it less likely that a person will be harmed, right? So prevention is really focused on, is my activity or program or whatever I'm doing going to lead to fewer children being harmed? And the way that works, as you can see in the box here, is that prevention addresses risk and protective factors, and it uses proven or at least theory-driven strategies. And it often focuses on building skills and or behaviors rather than just increasing knowledge or changing attitudes. So some of the questions we might be asking ourselves if we're trying to do a prevention program are, what skills do people need to prevent child sexual abuse? What risk and protective factors can I address? And what strategies do we know work when it comes to preventing child sexual abuse? All right. So I'm going to give you a second to just absorb a little bit of this information, because what we're going to do next is do a few poll questions where I'm going to give you an example of like a program or an activity or some sort of intervention that somebody might do. And you're going to need to categorize, is this an outreach activity, an awareness activity, or a prevention activity? All right. And I'll share the results with you, and then I'll tell you who's right in a second. All right, so here is our first one. Following a string of news stories about child sexual abuse in a town, the school district and local anti-sexual violence agency plan a debunking myths about child sexual abuse forum for parents. So would this activity be considered prevention, awareness, or outreach? All right, I'm gonna give y'all like 3 more seconds to answer. It's okay if you get it wrong. It's okay to just take a guess. All right. So here's the results. Most of you got this one right. So this is awareness. This is awareness. And again, like I said, these categories are not hard and fast. There's going to be some where it's like, it could be this, could be this. It's very likely that during an event like this, you would also be doing some outreach, like you'd be advertising, like these are the local resources people can get in touch with. But primarily, if the goal is we are debunking myths about child sexual abuse, we're raising awareness to give people an accurate understanding of the problem. All right. Let's do another one. Staff members from an anti-sexual violence agency leave resource brochures and business cards at local child care centers, after-school programs, and libraries which highlight the services they offer for children and teenagers. Is this prevention, awareness, or outreach? All right, 3, 2, 1. Great. So again, most folks are right on. This is outreach. You know, if the brochures have a bunch of information about like, here's how common child sexual abuse is or something like that, where they're doing a little bit of awareness, maybe it would be that too. But if it's really just, here are the services, here's who they're available for, that would be considered outreach. Nice job. All right, let's do this one. A local parent advocacy group and anti-sexual violence agency collaborate to offer an evidence-based parenting curriculum to the community. Is this prevention, awareness, or outreach? And this is a little bit tricky because we haven't talked about risk and protective factors yet today. So I'm asking you to just make some assumptions about what a parenting curriculum might accomplish. All right, 2 more seconds. Great. Okay. So this would be considered prevention. So good job, everyone. And the reason, as I said, we're going to talk about like what effective child sexual abuse prevention strategies actually look like. Parenting programs are one of those strategies. So you just had to kind of make a guess there. But yeah, this is like, hopefully this parenting curriculum, if it's evidence-based, it is likely teaching parents some skills, and that would potentially lead to a decrease in child sexual abuse. So that's great. All right. Here's our next one. I know we're doing a bunch of these, but the repetition is important. A middle school asks their local anti-sexual violence agency to do workshops for all students about how to intervene if a peer is making someone uncomfortable. Is this prevention, awareness, or outreach? Assuming that the people actually go in and do the programs. I sort of made it sound like this is like a preliminary, they're just asking, but let's assume that they go in and actually do the programs. What would that be? All right. So this is sort of where we've got, I would say, the most maybe confusion or you know, folks we're not quite as high in our correct answers we were with the others. This would be prevention, because this is a skill that you're teaching, right? We're teaching young people in this case how to intervene. So that's like a bystander intervention type strategy, which is a good strategy for preventing sexual violence. So yeah, it would be, and again, I think often when we do prevention, we're sort of also doing the other 2 things on this list. But if the main focus of this is we want students to be doing a new skill or like having a new behavior to help keep each other safe, then this would be prevention. All right, we'll do just one more. DCF advertises their care line in faculty lunchrooms at all of the schools in a district with instructions for how an adult could report suspected child sexual abuse. Prevention, awareness, or outreach. Two more seconds. All right. So 75% of you got this right. I would consider this outreach. Sort of depends on if there's any other information accompanying it. But if it's really just about, this is the resource for you to call if you think somebody has already been harmed, that's outreach. If there's, you know, a poster with a bunch of information about what child sexual abuse looks like and how common it is, then maybe that would be awareness as well. All right. Thank you all for participating in the polls. That was really fun for me. I hope it was fun for you. Okay, so we're also going to do also, let me pause for a second. Does anybody have questions or not? You know, have like, oh, I don't understand why this one was X, Y, or Z. Because I'm happy to talk more about any of them.
Oh, man.
Yeah, I think that last one was confusing for me
Yeah,
because would that be teaching the adults in the faculty room a skill to how to report? So yeah.
sure. Yeah, that makes sense, Sarah. Thanks for saying that. I would say the difference would be if DCF came to a school and was like, we're going to do a workshop to practice how you could respond to a disclosure from a kid. We're going to talk you through, like, here's what the phone call might sound like if you call the care line, or like that sort of a thing. It's not primary prevention because it's more like secondary prevention, because it's, you know, assuming that somebody has already been harmed. But if it's I think where we run into an issue is we sometimes put information out there and assume that the information is enough for people to then do the behavior, when actually people often need to like practice the behavior to do it. Does that make sense? Cool. That's a good question. Thank you for asking. Anybody else? Okay. If you think of anything, please don't hesitate to ask, and please don't assume that if you're the only one that's confused by something. We're doing this because we know that it's confusing. You know, we sort of use all these words like interchangeably, and we want to be clear about what they all mean. So that's why we're talking about this. Okay, so now we're going to talk about risk and protective factors. I'm going to try to breeze through this a little bit because we have a lot of content today, and I know some of this is familiar information for many of you. I will start at the top by just saying, while we have some research on what the risk factors are for either experiencing child sexual abuse or doing it, we need more research on all of this. It is difficult to find like really clear cut, like these are the things that might be going on in a person's life that make them more susceptible or more likely to experience this specifically child sexual abuse. If you look at like the CDC, they have risk factors for sexual violence, but it's not really specifically child sexual abuse. And they have risk factors for like child abuse and neglect, but not, again, child sexual abuse specifically. And we know that child sexual abuse is a really specific form of violence. So this is what we know, but it is certainly not a complete picture. And hopefully that we will continue to learn more, right? Not all of the risk factors on this screen are things that we have any control over or like we can do anything about. Things like gender, age. We know that girls and transgender kids are more at risk. We can't do anything about that, but it's good for us to know in terms of like the programming we offer, right? They're more at risk for experiencing child sexual abuse, not for committing it. Age, the risk for folks to experience violence tends to increase as they get older, although this does differ a little bit by gender. There's a lot of risk factors related to like family constellation. So sort of who is in a family, what does the family structure look like, and some around caregiver skills. And this is where we're going to talk about like parenting programs and things like that being effective strategies. We know that kids with disabilities are at a much higher risk of experiencing abuse than kids who do not have disabilities. We know that kids who are gay or lesbian or bi or queer are at a higher risk. Folks who have witnessed violence in their homes. Again, this is another, we're going to talk about partnerships that we could make in our communities. And so our domestic violence agencies or our dual agencies that are here with us right now, we know that witnessing violence in your home also makes it more likely that you might experience violence yourself. substance abuse in the family, living in poverty, living in communities with high rates of violence. So some of these are sort of bigger and bigger, more like societal problems or like community issues rather than individual. And then over on the right side, risk factors for committing violence or doing violence. Some of these are similar in their categories. There's a lot about, again, witnessing violence or experiencing violence yourself. Folks who need more skills in terms of empathy, communication, social skills, interpreting the cues, like the emotional cues of others, having poor childhood attachment or like parenting attachment. And then again, there's some stuff more societally, living in a community where societal norms say that like men are dominant and women should be submissive, or like, men are entitled to things like sex and power. Living in a community where there are weak laws and policies related to gender equity. So not even specifically child sexual abuse, but like laws and policies that would just support, pay equity or resource equity, things like that are risk factors for harming somebody. This is a big long list. I will send out these slides to folks afterwards. Don't feel like you need to write down everything. And then we know a few protective factors. There's even like a worse problem of not having enough research when it comes to protective factors, but experiencing really healthy parenting and having parents who feel confident in their skills as parents is a protective factor. Having all of your basic needs met. So living in a community where folks like have enough to eat, have safe places to live, etc. Having good communication skills, having good empathy or, understanding what might be going on for other people. Excuse me. Having an understanding of accountability or like a feeling of accountability. So people who know that like they are responsible for their own actions and the impact that those actions have on others are less likely to harm people. Again, more basic needs stuff, having access to medical care, preschool, after school care, policies that support families. And then there's some on here that are directly related to things that some of our agencies are doing. So participating in school-based child sexual abuse prevention programs, having the skills to engage in healthy relationships and having a healthy attitude about sexuality, and then positive parenting skill programming. So when we think about what is effective prevention, it addresses some or many of these risk and protective factors, right? So if a program is like directly dealing with one of these things, there's a chance that it will actually lead to fewer people being harmed. Okay, so knowing all of these risk and protective factors, I'm gonna give us just like 3 minutes in breakout rooms because we are super tight on our schedule today. I want you to talk about in breakout rooms, what could child sexual abuse prevention look like? And I want you to, whatever your agency is already doing, like if you're already doing school programming or working with parents or whatever, let's try to think about like, what else could it look like? It does not have to be stuff that your agency has control over or is actually able to do or wherever you work. But what could child sexual abuse prevention look like? And who else would need to be involved for those things to happen? All right. I'm going to put us, you'll be in a breakout room with like 3 or 4 people. And I'm going to set the breakout rooms to close after 2 minutes, but stay for the extra 60 seconds that it gives you, and then you'll come back. All right.
Kelsey, did you want to have a dialogue when folks get back, or did you want to jump to the next segment?
Maybe we'll just have folks put in the chat quickly. Yeah.
Sounds good.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. So we would love to hear, just if folks could put into the chat any ideas that you came up with. What does child sexual abuse prevention, what should it look like, or what could it look like? And who else would need to be involved for that to happen? Who do our community partners need to be?
I was kind of thinking of what you said about good empathy and communication skills, but maybe that could even be something that would be a co-ed community building idea, because sports teams are so segregated by gender as it is. So having something that both, all individuals could participate. And I think, doing group projects together and community building would help with that and build communication skills between, boys and girls and individuals.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I love sports teams in particular are a great, I'm sure some of us are working with sports teams already. There are great opportunities there because they also tend to have really clear like group identity, and that you can tap into that to build some good norms. All right, so I'm seeing more workshops for parents to support building protective factors at home. It'd be helpful to have schools involved as a place to host and connect with parents. Absolutely. Regardless of what we do, caregivers need to be involved to help connect through experience. Public service announcements, outlaw sleepovers. I don't know what that is, Marisol, but I'm very curious. All parents and caregivers should know red flags and how to protect kids. Absolutely. Some discussion about more like systems-based interventions. So DCF, juvenile court, probation, things that need to happen at home, conversations to have at home. So talking to parents and families, and spreading awareness and doing outreach on social media, because that can help get to youth. Absolutely. So really good ideas. And we're sort of broadening our idea of what prevention might look like, right? All right. I'm going to turn it back over to Bridget.
Okay, thanks, Kelsey. So now that we've kind of started with that preface, we want to dive in a little bit and talk about what this implementation would look like, what it does it look like to do this in our communities effectively, and what should these programs be guided by in order to ensure that they're effective. If you don't mind moving to the next slide, Kelsey. A little bit about program implementation, right? So what should implementation of prevention look like in communities? Well, under Connecticut state statute, every district is responsible for implementing a sexual assault and abuse prevention and awareness program. So we're already in a good spot in that this is something that's on folks' radar, at least, under that statute should be. Now, when we're looking at those programs in those educational environments, it's absolutely necessary to include school staff in planning the programming. And we're going to definitely dive into why as we talk through some of the guidelines for program implementation. Presenters always must be prepared to manage triggered or disclosing school personnel or students, right? So if somebody wants to discuss their own experience of sexual violence, we need to ensure that presenters are always prepared for that. Which you're all, well positioned for in your, those of you who are member center advocates, right? But that's kind of where it's critically important that you're engaged in this process as well. Presenters must always be prepared to manage Oh, just read that, sorry. It's also recommended that parents and guardians have the opportunity to learn about the sexual assault and abuse prevention and awareness curriculum and to review the materials. This allows the program to be applied to and demonstrated in different settings, and for these concepts to be reinforced at home in addition, addition to their educational environments. And of course, families may feel uncomfortable broaching these topics, with their children and among one another. And this content that is provided to them can give them a starting point, kind of show them the language that they can utilize, give them an idea of what's developmentally appropriate, right, given the age of that child. So this is all critically important to consider. These lessons should be evidence informed. They need to be developmentally and age appropriate, and they need to be informed by the required curricular standards and performance indicators that are going to be outlined in the next piece that we're talking about. But it's important to remember that no matter how comprehensive the programming may be, the sort of programming, right, when we're talking about a presentation that might be done in a classroom and the materials that might accompany it, it's only one aspect of sexual violence prevention in a community. So we want to ensure that we're keeping our scope pretty large when we're considering what prevention needs to look like in our communities and not restrict it to, even the most comprehensive program. If you don't mind moving to the next, awesome. So as I stated, we need to ensure that these lessons are evidence informed and continuously evaluated. We need to make sure that they are appropriate for the age and development of the youth that we are working with, and we want to ensure that they are well informed by the curricular standards that the state has laid out for us. So with that being said, I want to kind of dig into what some of those principles of prevention look like. What do these guidelines look like under the state? And what should our prevention programs essentially look like in order to ensure that they are as effective as they can be in our communities? So we want to, of course, ensure that we're presenting a comprehensive program. So a comprehensive program will, of course, be more than a single lesson or session. So we want to ensure that there are multiple lessons and sessions, as we know that will ensure that the youth retain that information and families retain that information in a way that they do not retain the information and apply it when there is a singular program. Again, no matter how good that program may be. We want to ensure that in being a comprehensive program, it incorporates lessons and skill building in a variety of settings, right? This is why it's critically important that, as much as possible, this information is connected to their home and to their larger community in addition to the educational space that they're in. And that's how the lesson should be framed as well, right? This isn't just something that should be applied to their educational space. So that's, in part why it's so important to include families, to include educators. This is something, as they say, sort of, it takes a village, right? So we want to ensure that all members of the community are engaged to some extent and delivering, the same, and similar messages to youth to reinforce them. We want to ensure, of course, that we have varied teaching methods as we're providing any sort of presentation. So we want to make sure that there is a discussion element. We want to make sure that there are activities for youth to participate in. We want to have skill-based components. We, of course, know that all people, including youth, learn in different ways, and we want to ensure that all youth have access to something that's so critically important. And additionally, it can ensure that, again, these skills are being applied in a variety of different ways, and that children are really forming, a strong understanding of what's being presented to them. We want to highlight the importance of sufficient instructional time. Again, one-time presentations will unfortunately rarely affect behavioral change, and that's something that we know from program evaluations. So we want to ensure that, as much as we know time may be limited in schools, right, with all the standardized testing, with all of the lessons that are required, this is something that's so critically important to the wellness of our youth and communities that we need to ensure that we are really taking the time to have, sufficient comprehensive programs. We, of course, want these programs to be theory driven. So we want to use theory models that have been shown to positively affect behavior or some kind of social change. We want to ensure that they are intentionally designed to address a certain problem, or to achieve a particular goal. So it's important that we sort of frame them and design them in that way. We need to ensure that we're fostering positive relationships, right? So effective programs will always build positive relationships between children and adults and children and their peers. Again, that's why it's critically important to ensure that they're dynamic in their teaching methods, because we want to ensure that this is going to impact the way that they engage with others in a positive manner. They need to be developmentally appropriate, and this is something we're going to kind of dive into later. But we need to ensure that they're well-timed based on child development. Kelsey is going to be providing a little bit of information about what that might look like in terms of some of the state's guidelines. I'm going to share a little bit more about different types of development, and it's a whole topic of its own. But we want to really ensure that we are evaluating our programs and ensuring that children are understanding what we're presenting to them, and ensuring that it's appropriate, ideally before we do the presentation in the first place. There are a lot of resources out there as well that we can definitely share that address development. So that's definitely something in your follow-up email. There's one in particular I have in mind that I will definitely send over to everybody. But essentially, we can kind of look at the ideal outcomes for each age group and kind of frame some of our programming around those ideal outcomes. We want to ensure that our programming is culturally relevant. Every school and every district, even different age groups need to tailor materials to best reach the target population that is being served in order for that content to be relevant to them and motivating to them and as effective as possible. Again, this is why it's so critically important to work collaboratively with educators and folks in that educational environment, given that they, ideally have a strong understanding of what those elements look like in their own institution. We need to emphasize the importance of outcome evaluation. I know that's something that I've touched on a couple of times already, and I know Kelsey has as well, but it's so critically important. We need to ensure that evaluations are built into the program to assess how effective these programs are. They need to be constantly evaluated, and they need to be refined in order to improve our outcomes, right? So it's important that we continue to evaluate it and know that we never have a perfect program, right? That it's always going to be something that is in the works to some extent and being molded based on the needs of, folks at that time, based on new information, based on evaluation. And then lastly, we need well-trained staff. So it's critically important that staff who are involved in prevention to any extent have initial and ongoing training, whether they're delivering programs, whether they're handling disclosures. Again, this is something that we're constantly evaluating, we're constantly understanding more about, and that it's important to have that support around in a training space, right? Or a staff development space. So we want to ensure that all staff involved are well-trained. Yep, and I see somebody wrote here in the chat, it's important to meet the needs of all learners. Absolutely, and that's why these programs need to be, dynamic in their different teaching methods, and why we need to evaluate to ensure that the information is getting across. So I just threw a lot at you through these 9 points here. Does anybody have any questions about the principles of prevention that are outlined?
Or even just reactions. Maybe you don't, it may be hard to come up with a specific question right now, but if you're like, oh my God, well, I don't know how to do this, or, this is really different from what we've been doing. Feel free to just voice like a reaction that you're having as well. We know that this is a lot of information, and for some of us, it might feel different than what we've been doing, what we've been taught is the right thing to do, or could feel overwhelming potentially. So we're here for all of the reactions. Yeah, Louisa, go ahead.
My thing is all this is great. We've been talking about this for so many years. It's wonderful. The thing is the evaluations. That's the hardest piece of it all, because when you're going in, depending on the grade, depending on how much time you have, like doing evaluations, how is that being done? Because I mean, if we go into a class and we literally have 45 minutes to do a class, it takes them 5 minutes to sit down and get settled, and then takes 5 to 10 minutes to do an evaluation. That means we have 30 minutes to do our workshop. And even if we go in there twice, that's still 30 minutes each time. So how do we do these, especially with little ones?
Yeah, and as Bridget was saying, I think Bridget had just said at some point in the last few minutes that like we're at the Alliance are happy to provide technical assistance around all of this, and to have like as many conversations post this training about it as we need to come up with solutions, because it's likely going to be different for every setting. I think working with some of the information that we've provided today hopefully also helps like strengthen your case for like why you need more time in schools. I know that that's a big ask for schools, and we are not like holding you all accountable to like the whims of a school district, or like, what individual administrators say is and is not possible. But, doing evaluations like at time when you're not there, maybe like can a teacher like distribute a survey, or coach students through like answering a few questions before or after you get there. I know that the electronic clicker things, if anybody has those, I've used those for evaluations before, and they are a little time intensive to get set up. So I hear you about the like not having enough time in an individual lesson, but they're easy for little kids to use. I think folks are using electronic surveys. I'm happy to talk about this more, and I know that evaluation is really hard. And so the other thing I would just say is that if we're in a situation where we really don't have time to do evaluation, or it's just whatever barriers there are, the more we can be relying on programs that have already been evaluated by other people that are like, we know that this is effective because we've done research on it, then it's less important that we do the evaluation ourselves, because we already know, other people have already figured out it's effective, if that makes sense. Yeah. It's hard. It's all
We just
hard.
need to have a whole conversation just on evaluations.
Yeah. And we literally could do a whole training on it. I'm very happy to put that together, because I think this is,
Yes, please.
this is a hard subject.
But it's one we want to ensure we're providing support on.
Right, because I actually am scheduled to be in a school in 2 weeks. And all middle school kids. And they are giving me the time that I have fought for, but still not enough time. So,
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that amount of time is definitely, something we see as a significant barrier. And the feedback that we hear from folks is the amount of time that they're given. But I definitely think Kelsey responded in all the ways that I would have as well. And I really appreciate all of that, Kelsey. And in collaborating with, educators wherever we can, for them to utilize their time in a certain way if we are not present, or to hopefully, ideally, be able to advocate for more time given some of the evidence and some of what we know about the sort of prevention programming. And I think definitely the point about utilizing, programs that have had that evaluation done is so critical. So thank you so much, Kelsey. Does anybody else have any,
I just,
somebody gave, did you want to?
yeah, Sarah, thanks for sharing. The CT Data Collaborative does a bunch of trainings. And so I know they did one recently on like survey design. We can send out the website for this resource. They do trainings all the time. I agree. I think they're super helpful.
Yeah.
If you want to learn how to like build a good survey, how to figure out what you're asking and design questions that will get you the information you're looking for. So thanks for saying that, Sarah.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks. Anything else? Well, thank you, Louisa, for jumping in, and Sarah for that mention as well. And I'll give it back to Kelsey.
All right. So we are going to talk about the social ecological model for a bit here. I know many of us are probably familiar with this. And to just reiterate something that Bridget previously said, our school-based programs or are really just any one prevention strategy, whether that's working with students or working with parents or working with coaches or whatever, one strategy alone is not going to prevent all child sexual abuse from happening, right? So it's important to look at strategies that might work across we are going to call this the social ecology or the social ecological model. And so there's these 4 levels or like spheres of the model. I'm not going to go like deep into all of this because it's fairly intuitive. And I think many of us have probably heard about this before, but there are strategies that touch on an individual and like an individual's ability to, respond to situations that are risky or to manage their own behavior or to interact well with others and manage their own feelings. There's strategies that deal with the relationship sphere. So how do people interact with one another? At a community level, we're more talking about like the schools, the workplaces, the neighborhoods, like how are we preventing violence in that arena? Or like, are we using strategies that touch on those spaces? And then at a societal level, we're talking about obviously like a whole community of people. What are the norms in that community? In that community or in that society, is violence acceptable? Are there consequences for violence? Like, what does that look like? So this is probably maybe a very easy question, but just to get us started thinking about this, where would a classroom-based prevention program, so it's teaching skills, it's teaching bystander intervention, where would that fit on the social ecology? Which level would you put that at, a classroom-based program? Feel free to unmute or to chat. All right, so I'm seeing some community, which is potentially true. It sort of depends on how comprehensive the classroom-based program is. I think many of our prevention programs are really more addressing an individual, like if you're doing, for example, I know a lot of our educators do like social emotional learning programs, right? And we're teaching like awareness about our own feelings. That is an individual skill, right? To manage your own feelings, to respond appropriately, etc. If the prevention program is teaching like, here's how to better interact with your peers, here's how to manage conflict with your peers, here's how to intervene if something's happening at school, right? That might be more of a relationship thing. If you are in like every classroom in a school and you're also working with like the teachers and the administrators, then I would say that it's a community level strategy. And if, maybe you've got like posters up in the hallways and there's other places where we're reinforcing some of the ideas, then I would say it's community. So it sort of depends on what we're doing. All of those things are useful, right? Like no one of these is better than the other. They're all useful. Okay. So we're going to come back to the social ecology. But first, we're going to touch upon some considerations for working with kids and with families. So these apply to programs that we might be doing in schools. They also apply to if you're an advocate and you're working with an individual family. This is good information for working with them as well. Some of this are things we have said at previous Summer Institute sessions because we know that reinforcement of ideas is really important. So first of all, we need to remember, we all know this, it is adults' responsibility to keep kids safe, right? It is not a child's responsibility to avoid being sexually abused. It is on adults to create environments and to create systems and to train other adults on how to keep kids safe, right? So that's first and foremost. So this is where also, if you are looking at curricula or looking at some sort of activity or a program, and you're trying to figure out, is this program in line with what Kelsey and Bridget were talking about in that training the other day? This would be a good list to consult. So does the program do these things or does it do the opposite of what we're asking? Because there are programs out there that do the opposite of some of these things. It's good to remember that we've talked about this before. Kids have a hard time distinguishing between things like good or bad touch or safe or unsafe touch. Just developmentally, it is difficult sometimes to understand like what is good or bad, what is safe or unsafe, depending on the age of the kids. Also, we know that not all sexual abuse is necessarily going to feel like a bad thing necessarily, just in terms of like what it feels like to a person's body or to a kid's body. So that can be a little bit confusing for kids to parse out. So we don't necessarily want to be teaching kids good touch and bad touch or safe and unsafe touch. It just may in the end not be that useful for them. Similarly, there are some, I know because I have read through some curricula that offer stuff like this, that sort of tell kids like trust your gut or like trust your instincts. If if it feels like this is wrong, then something's wrong. Kids have a hard time doing that. Like how does a kid know what their instinct is telling them necessarily? And I think it sometimes puts kids in a position of feeling a little bit of shame if they have then experienced something and they say, oh, well, I should have trusted my gut, before this happened and told somebody about it. Also, we know that trauma, the effects of trauma on somebody's brain and body can lead to different reactions, or, a person might feel numb or a reaction that's maybe sort of unexpected given what the behavior is. That makes it even more confusing to interpret, like, what's my gut telling me about this situation?
Yeah. Kelsey, if you don't mind, just if I could jump in quickly.
Yeah,
children are also much more likely to dissociate during an experience of abuse when compared to adults, especially young children. So that dissociation that they're experiencing can also further separate them from that acknowledgement of a bad touch or the acknowledgement of a bad gut feeling, either in that moment or in the future, given that disconnect that they may have from their bodies. So it's really critically important that we acknowledge, that response that a lot of children have as well.
Thanks. Just some language that's helpful we want to tell young people that they can report to an adult if they experience something rather than they have to or they must, just to avoid the shame or the blame that kids might feel if they, for whatever reason, couldn't report, didn't feel safe telling someone, couldn't figure out how to talk about it. We want to always be using the anatomically correct names for body parts. I know we've talked about that before. Bystander intervention is a really empowering and an effective strategy for preventing sexual violence. Now, when I say bystander intervention, I am not saying that other kids need to be keeping kids safe from adults. That's not what we're talking about. I am talking about other adults being aware of what's going on, knowing how to intervene. We also, we do teach bystander intervention when it comes to like peer interactions, right? And so that might be appropriate, but we're not relying on kids to like protect other kids. But we can train adults on how to intervene if something is wrong or if they feel like something is inappropriate. And then this last point, again, I know we just talked about being doing evaluation of our programming as much as we can. So these are some of our best practices. And I know we've got a question in the chat. So would defining okay touch, not okay touch fall under the same category of being unhelpful or not effective? I just think whatever language we're using, sort of creating this binary of like, how does it feel to you? Does it feel good or bad? Does it feel okay or not okay? For a lot of kids, that is not going to work. So I would say we want to avoid doing that. Yeah, so that's my short answer to that question.
Would you say like boundaries, like talking about boundaries would probably be the more effective way? And like, for example, this giving examples of if an adult tried to cross a boundary, this is definitely harmful, and you can tell an adult if this happened.
Yeah, and Bridget, feel free to jump in if you have thoughts about this too. I think other things I've seen that feel useful to me, especially when we're working with little kids, I know many of us are like giving specific examples of behavior. So maybe this is sort of what you were saying, Sarah, about like crossing boundaries, but like being really clear about what some of those behaviors are. And that I know there are curricula out there that do some like, they sort of defined body parts as like either private or, like body parts that are nobody should be touching unless it's, your parent who's helping you be safe and healthy or something like that. Yeah, I think we just have to think about like what is realistic for kids to understand. And also like, is what we're teaching them reinforcing the idea that like kids are somehow responsible for keeping themselves safe?
Yeah, I think that's the critically important piece too, is that, we want to, of course, empower children, but not make it seem as if, they're responsible exclusively, right, as a self-protector, but also that there are adults protecting them as well. It's important to recognize as well that a lot of the time these, in practice, right, when people are giving these lessons, it seems as if children are able to categorize, but when they're actually put in the situation, can't necessarily carry that same understanding over to the situation itself. So even if it appears to be effective in that moment, as they're potentially talking through those different categories, when it's applied to real life, it's not necessarily something that children are able to understand and apply to the extent that, that we would hope. And additionally, that it isn't necessarily always, that there are other ways that we can better be doing prevention that we want to draw time to, right? So I think everything Kelsey said as well was on point. But I think any sort of binary like that, we want to kind of avoid and instead kind of focus more largely on a child, having agency over their body, having the ability to have their own privacy, and also sort of acknowledge other, red flags that they could look out for, but again, more specifically, right? Rather than attempting to categorize those experiences into boxes that might not necessarily apply to that child's experience.
Thank you.
Also, I don't mean to say that we shouldn't talk about boundaries. I do think, especially when it comes to how are we interacting with our peers, like boundaries are really important. Recognizing like, oh, is my behavior, how is it making this other person feel? Like, body language, facial, all that stuff around boundaries, super important and great to talk about. So I'm not saying don't talk about that. That's all.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that too, we want to make sure we're acknowledging the nuance, right? Because one child on the playground may be, comfortable somehow having physical contact with his friend on the playground, and then another child does not feel comfortable having physical touch on the playground. And a playful, say they're playing tag, right? In a way that's, potentially appropriate, but we want to ensure that there's more so that recognition of agency over one's body, and that we are respecting, individuals and their different boundaries and ability to, consent or not consent to something. And that it's, because we want to acknowledge that people may have different boundaries over their bodies and that we need to respect that.
Any other questions, thoughts about the best practices we're talking about or any of this? Okay. All right, so now we're gonna get, oh, whoops, I forgot this was on here. Okay, so sort of the flip side of just things we want to avoid, and some of this we have already talked about. So we talked about single dose programming. Again, if you are wanting to strategize about how to get schools to give you more time, please come talk to me. Let's talk about it. Peer-led programs are, so I know that's maybe not what you would be doing in like a classroom setting, but maybe in more of an after school or on a college campus. There's just really mixed results in the research around if peer education programs or like peer-led programs are effective. So I would say do a lot of, if this is something you wanted to do and you're hoping for a specific outcome related to violence prevention, to do a lot of research into like, does this strategy work with preventing child sexual abuse, preventing sexual violence of college students, whatever you're trying to do. We've talked about the evaluation piece, and then relying on a single program or strategy, working in silos, makes our work less effective. So I'm going to talk through some strategies that are effective in the next piece, and you're going to see that they cover the whole social ecology, the whole social ecological model. Because in a perfect world with all of the resources and all of the partnerships, this is the kind of stuff we would be doing in all of our communities, right? Not we as in you yourselves, but we, the royal we, I suppose. All right, so there is a package, a technical package, which just means a big document put out by the CDC called Inspire. This presents 7 sort of categories of strategies for ending violence against children. So it's not actually specifically child sexual abuse, it is all violence against children. But then within each category, they've pulled out some that are effective for child sexual abuse specifically. So I'm going to talk you through a few pieces of this. Again, not because I'm expecting anyone on this call to be like, oh, now it is my job to go out and get this policy passed, me as an individual advocate or an individual educator or whatever, but because it's important to know what should our communities look like if we care about keeping kids safe, right? So the first piece is laws and policies. And so 2 categories of laws and policies that are effective in reducing child sexual abuse are the laws and policies actually related to child sexual abuse and exploitation. So when they are clear, when they have like a broad definition of what child sexual abuse is and all of the various behaviors that might be included when they talk about grooming and things like that. But the other category of laws that it turns out are related to CSA prevention are around alcohol. And so if you think back to our risk factors, we talked about substance abuse briefly, and when a community has really strong laws around alcohol, and so some of the things specifically are like when the age where you can purchase alcohol is higher versus lower, when the cost of alcohol is higher. So like in some communities, they sometimes raise the price of alcohol to make it a little bit less accessible to people. When there are not like big clusters of establishments where people could buy alcohol all together, like, right near each other, then they actually see some reductions in child sexual abuse in those communities. So my question for you now, we're going to do some more polls, is, we did that one already. Where on the social ecological model would laws about alcohol fall? So which part of this model would we be dealing with if we had really strong laws related to alcohol? 2 more seconds. All right. So most of us said societal or society. And that's totally right. Depending on it, actually, it sort of depends on, exactly, are we talking about like statewide or citywide or whatever? Obviously, we can have policies at different levels. Community could also be the right answer here. If maybe on a really, really small level, a community decided, oh, we're gonna change the zoning so that you can't have this many alcohol establishments in one area or something like that. It might be more of a community focus than a whole society focus. But yeah, and generally when we're talking about laws and policies, we are talking a lot about like the societal or community level. So another part of this package, this Inspire package, are programs and campaigns that seek to change norms. So in places where norms are just like the things that are considered acceptable or unacceptable in a community, right? And so in communities or groups where there is really strict adherence to gender roles or like expectations that people fall into certain categories based on their gender, and so they behave certain ways based on their gender, that is a risk factor for child sexual abuse. We talked earlier, one of our risk factors was sort of like communities where there's really heightened like male entitlement or belief that men should be in charge and are the dominant people in that community. There can also be norms around bystander behavior. Is it considered acceptable or unacceptable for somebody to speak up and say, like, I'm concerned about how this adult is behaving towards this child? And just generally violence against children. Is it considered acceptable or unacceptable? And what does that look like? So if you were to look at this whole Inspire package, and we'll send this out to all of you in a follow-up email, they identify a few specific programs and strategies that have been used. It's not all just in the United States, it's worldwide. So there's a program in Uganda, for example, that trained influential community members and leaders strategies for shifting the norms in whatever their community was. Maybe it's just their neighborhood, maybe it's like a group of parents that they're friends with, maybe it's their kids' school. The norms they were trying to shift were around recognizing your own power and how to use that power for good. So sort of like bystander behavior a bit. And they saw positive results in terms of more adults choosing to intervene to keep kids safe. So that's like one example of a program that was designed to change norms. So as you can probably predict, I have a polling question for you. So where on the social ecological model would programs that seek to change norms fall? Take 2 more seconds. Okay. All right, so we are sort of mixed with this one, which makes sense because it actually could be a few of these. So we've got some folks saying society, some saying community. So again, it sort of depends. Apologies that many of the answers are not actually as clear cut as I would lead you to believe by only letting you pick one answer in the poll. If you are, I would probably say community for this one, but if you were doing a big norms change campaign that addresses like a really, really big group of people, if we got, like federally or like nationally, we had some big campaign happening, I would argue that that is like a societal approach. Sort of depends on how you define society, I suppose. And certainly on a community level, it could change behaviors within institutions. Also, relationship could be the right answer here too, because it certainly could change how people interact with one another, within their own families, within their groups of friends, what have you. So pretty much everyone's right on this one. All right. Next one. So another strategy that has been shown to be effective from this Inspire package are home visiting programs. And this was a strategy that did come out of the United States called the Nurse Family Partnership, where they had nurses visiting first-time moms in their homes over the first 2 years of their child's life. They did some solid research on this. They did like a 15-year follow-up study with the families that had this intervention or this partnership, and they found a 48% reduction in child abuse with folks who had the home visiting versus folks who had not. This could be, there's probably many people besides in the United States and besides this specific program that are doing things like this. Basically, including people in our own communities. So this is a really good example of something that I don't expect any of our member centers to start implementing a home visiting program necessarily. They're very time and resource intensive, but are there programs in a town that you're currently working in where that partnership might make sense, right? Or could you find out when somebody goes to visit a family in a home, what kind of stuff are they talking about? Could we get them to talk a little bit about child sexual abuse or about any of the risk or protective factors we talked about earlier, right? So let's see, where would this one fall? Where on the social ecological model would nurse-run home visiting programs fall? Who we are like totally evenly split. Oh, it's changing a little bit, but okay. Here's what we've got for this one. I should have probably given you a little more information about what the nurses were doing when they were in the home. That would have been helpful for answering this question. So they were doing some like parenting skills, talking about healthy attachment, stuff like that. So for folks who said, I would put this as a relationship level strategy because it's how are then the parents interacting with their kids. So what's going on like within their family. Individual might also make sense for this because we're building an individual person's confidence, their skills in being a parent. So that would also work. It would take sort of like working with an entire community of people and being really widespread for this to be a community level strategy. But that would be really cool. All right. We'll go through, I'm not going to have us do polls on all of these because I think we're getting the idea. Another strategy, we've talked about this already, parenting programs. So any parenting program that is building skills or confidence or child attachment, because that is one of our risk and protective factors, could be effective in reducing child sexual abuse. There's a specific curriculum called, in some countries, it's called Parents Matter, and in others, it's called Families Matter, that is really focused specifically on improving parent and child communication about things like sex and sexuality and sexual abuse. I believe that curriculum is typically offered to parents who have kids who are between the ages of like 9 and 12 or something like that to help them feel confident having conversations about those. This would again be like a relationship level strategy because it's affects or targets how parents are interacting with their kids, with their families. This is effective. Income and economic strengthening. So again, in a like world in which we got to influence all of the big structures around us and policy and whatnot, this is an effective strategy for reducing child sexual abuse. Are cash transfers, literally just helping people get out of poverty. We talked about poverty as a risk factor. So a strategy that helps people get out of poverty is also going to help protect against child sexual abuse, partly because it improves gender equity. So there's, if you look through the package, you can see in some countries, they use the strategy of just literally providing extra funding for people who are living in poverty, and saw, improvement in school attendance, more equitable relationships between men and women in the community, and less child sexual abuse. This is a societal level strategy or community level, again, depending on how you sort of define like what is a society, what is a community, but it's a big level strategy. Okay, So besides the Inspire package, which I will send to you all, this is one other document that I will send to you all. The CDC's Essentials for Childhood framework, which talks, just sort of reinforces the ideas that home visiting programs, parenting programs, those can be effective strategies. And there's some others in there as well. Again, not that I am telling anybody that you need to go out and start doing tons of parenting programs, but if you're looking for something that feels effective and you're like, we want to try something new, this is an option. Or are there people already doing parenting programs in your communities that you could partner with, that you could help bolster their work or be referring families to that kind of program, things like that. All right. So let's do, Bridget, how long should we do? I want to do a breakout room for a few minutes here. How long do you think we should do? I think we're doing okay.
Yeah, we're doing all right. We could do maybe like 4 or 5 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes,
Yeah.
depending on how long folks want to have the conversation.
Perfect. Okay, so all of this information that we're throwing at you today, I would love for you in breakout rooms to talk about how are these ideas different from what you've been taught, or what you, that should say think, what you currently think, how you currently think of child sexual abuse prevention, and what could you add or change about your current approaches. And I would encourage you to try to not get too caught up in the actual logistics of like implementing a new idea, because we know that's hard and we're not going to come up with all the strategies right now. But just what's a new idea you'd want to try, or you'd want to reach out to a community partner to see if we can make it happen. All right. So I'm going to set these up for 4 minutes, and please give yourself the extra 60 seconds at the end, and then we'll have you come back. So Bridget, I think we should be okay in terms of like, you should definitely have time to do your piece about developmentally appropriate.
Yeah, I was just writing you a message. I think as long as my segment starts around 2:45, we should be in great shape, because that gives me maybe, even a couple minutes after. But as long as I have about 10 minutes, not even, to talk about that. And then just the, 5 minutes for the conclusion, so we can just wrap it up.
Cool.
But yeah, we're in good shape.
Great.
Time-wise. So you just want to have a quick, like, if anybody wants to share highlights when they get back?
Yeah. All right, welcome back, everybody. We would love to hear if folks just have anything you want to share from your breakout room. What you talked about, answers to either of these questions on the screen. Anybody want to share? Okay, and it's all right if not. I think we're a little bit like information overloaded today. We really crammed a lot into this presentation. So totally fine if folks are just processing and like sitting with it all. All right, so I'm gonna hand it over to Bridget.
I do see one in the chat. We are currently doing one parent group in our area. If the research shows that's effective, we can try to do more. I think that's fantastic. Thanks for sharing. All right. As I was stating earlier, one of the really critical pieces when we're designing these programs, whether it be an actual like lesson or session, or when we're looking at how to approach a community, family, we want to ensure that it's always going to be developmentally appropriate, right? So we want to also ensure that we're doing this strategically, that we implement programming and skills that are building on each other based on age group and based on aging. Each grade cluster that we work with should learn lessons that are reflecting their current developmental issues, maybe different things that they're facing either personally or socially, right? And also prepare children for what may be an upcoming developmental stage. It's also important that we recognize that children may have some variation, right, in where they are in terms of their development. And we want to ensure that we also kind of create some space for them to access this information. So no matter, kind of where exactly they're at. So recognize that there is some nuance here, right? However, when we are kind of looking at generally how we want to acknowledge developmental stages, we need to kind of break it down into a variety of what needs they might have based on, physical changes, cognitive stages. So we're going to break that down a little. So of course, physically, we recognize and want to acknowledge that children are growing, physically in their height and weight throughout the time that we may be working with them, right? Their bodies may be undergoing puberty, and that's something we want to prepare them for or acknowledge in programming. And they will be changing from bodies of children to bodies of adults who are capable of reproducing. So those are all things that we want to prepare them for and ensure we're keeping in mind. We also want to keep in mind that cognitively, they're going to be maturing in their own ability to think, to organize, to solve problems, to predict consequences to their actions, to the actions of others, right? So we want to kind of look at where they might be cognitively and whether or not they'll be able to grasp certain concepts, right? When Kelsey and I were talking earlier about the fact that younger children might not be able to, acknowledge things in the binary the way that we can as adults. In a way that would be helpful for them. That's kind of goes into some of that cognitive development. So we want to kind of consider where they might be cognitively in order to ensure that our programming is accessible. Psychologically, socially, and emotionally, we recognize that children are developing as well. So throughout the time that we may be engaged with them in this prevention work, they're learning how to be in familial, friend, platonic, right, professional, and eventually romantic relationships with other people. And so in order for them to, operate through these relationships in a way that's healthy, we want to acknowledge the current social conditions that they may be in, as well as what social conditions may be upcoming, right? If, say, children are at kind of a point where they may start to engage in romantic relationships. How can we ensure we teach them about healthy relationship skills before they start to enter into, the dating world? We want to ensure as well, emotionally, that children are learning how to identify, comprehend, and regulate their emotions. In recognizing that they might have varied ability to do so based on their age, but no matter what age they're in, this is a really critical skill that they need to build in order to have healthy relationships with others, in order to communicate, and in order to, build in their emotional health. Children are understanding who they are, and they're establishing their identity, socially, and they're involving in that self-concept and where they fit in the world as they continue to grow and as we continue to engage with them. So for instance, we know that individuals, especially in middle school and also high school, are highly influenced by their peers, right? So how do we acknowledge the influence that they might, that their peers might have over them, and how that plays into some of these dynamics as we talk about things like, bystander intervention, or we talk about things, about healthy relationships, right? How do we acknowledge that sort of relationship that exists in those communities between youth? Morally, youth are learning to distinguish between right and wrong, and in response to familial, peer, community, and societal norms, right? So really young children might just think that certain things are normal, but, are still learning that these are things that are wrong to do, right? And they're still kind of figuring all of that out. They're also growing through the time we may be engaging with them in formulating their own personal system of values. So it's important to kind of acknowledge that development and acknowledge that the ways that we talk about these issues may help to ensure that, youth are recognizing the way that how these issues are fitting into their own personal system of values, and the way that they'll move through the world harming others or not harming others, right? And then sexually, of course, children and emerging adults are continuing to develop. So they're discovering how their bodies work. They're developing feelings about their bodies, right? And that's something that is definitely going to change over time based on social development, right? The way that a child sees their body when they're much younger, it may change as they are influenced by their peers and social norms. They're learning to care for their bodies physically and emotionally. They are coming to understand their gender identity and their gender expression. They are also coming to understand their sexual and romantic attraction. So we want to acknowledge that we are making space for all of that development, and acknowledging and affirming, youth as they come to understand, and express their gender identity and sexual and romantic attractions, right? They're also learning how to be in sexual and romantic relationships. So aside from how they, understand themselves and their own body, they're also learning about, how they're engaging potentially with others now or in the future, again, in preparing and looking forward. They're learning to respect the boundaries of themselves and of others. It's critically important to acknowledge both those, right? They need to learn to respect their own boundaries. And that's something that's sometimes overlooked, right? When folks will just talk about other people's boundaries, but we want to ensure that youth feel empowered to respect and understand their own boundaries, but also, of course, the boundaries of others. We also want to ensure that they know how to make healthy decisions for themselves sexually. And that's something that is also going to be changing over time, what exactly those conversations look like. Eventually, of course, leading to conversations about, how to engage in safe sex with, a consenting partner, right? In terms of what consent looks like, in terms of STIs and birth control and things of that nature. So it's really important to kind of acknowledge all of these stages of development, because we need to look at the way that they stack on top of each other and think strategically to the future as to how we want to, sort of build upon these, relationships with youth and community and build on their knowledge through the course of their growing. Any questions about this piece? Any comments, anything? Anybody wanted to jump in with? All right. With that, we can move forward, I suppose, to our last few slides here. So it's really critical, we just wanted to reiterate, as we said at the start of this program, and as how Kelsey had sort of framed this information there, we need all adults to be all in all of the time. Again, to echo the sentiment that they shared earlier, it is our responsibility as adults to, protect children and prevent, these, acts of violence from happening to children in our communities. So of course, we really appreciate your presence here and your engagement over the last several weeks as, part of your work in that goal. But we always want to remind folks that we need to continue this work, right? That this is perhaps just a building block of it or the start of that journey, depending on where you're at. So we want to continue your engagement with us and with these ideas and this work beyond today. So here's your opportunity to continue to engage by asking all of the questions. So if there's any lingering question about any aspect of this 3-part series, now is your time. Of course, you can always reach out to one of us after the program and we'd be happy to engage. But if there's anything outstanding on your mind now, other folks may be able to benefit from that question and maybe thinking the same thing. So with that, does anybody have any lingering questions?
We wanted to reiterate. Somebody started talking, I think. No? Okay. We also just wanted to reiterate, I know we said this earlier today, that we, Bridget, myself, other folks at the Alliance are here to help strategize how, if you're thinking of doing something new or you want to change something about some element of your child sexual abuse approach, prevention, response, whatever it is, that you do not need to do it alone, or you don't need to do it without assistance from folks at the Alliance. That is what we are here for. So we are very aware that this is a lot of information and potentially lots of new ideas for folks. And please, please, please talk to me, talk to Bridget, talk to whoever at the Alliance you regularly go to for technical assistance, and we will help.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kelsey. So I suppose with that, then, if there aren't any lingering questions, we'll move to our next point, which is our self-care reminder. So as we shared at the top of this program, this isn't always an easy topic to focus 2 hours of your day on in this manner, right? Child sexual abuse is something that can be triggering, it can be upsetting. And we want to ensure that regardless of how you're responding, it's also something that can build up, right? Even if we don't acknowledge that we're feeling some kind of way today. We want to ensure you're taking time to take care of yourselves. So as I shared at the gate, I wrote down right here my dog's name, and I am going to be taking a nice long walk with him before the rain starts to make sure he gets some good exercise in and make him happy, and that'll make me happy. So that is my plan for self-care, and I hope that you are also inspired to engage in some self-care this afternoon or evening, just after today's program. Additionally, if you do want to process anything, Kelsey and I will be available after the program, and we'll ensure that we are the last ones on if anybody needs to process. All right, so with that, we do have a program evaluation that addresses today's session, as well as the 3-part program that you've been attending. So we're going to drop that in the chat. Evaluation. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a few minutes to fill that out, it would be so helpful to us. We're currently in the process of creating more programming for the year, specifically geared toward folks who are working with children and families. So we want to ensure that it is informed by your feedback on today's program and this 3-part session. So please just take a few minutes if you can to fill that out, and it would be so appreciated by us and by, I'm sure, anybody who will attend the program in the future. Additionally, right above that, I did add the sign-in form for anybody who may have jumped in a little late or needed it once more to ensure that you get your certificates of completion. So just fill that out. Once again, please fill out the eval if you can. And feel free to reach out to Kelsey or myself if you have any lingering questions, any thoughts. But with that, thank you so much for spending the summer, on this topic with us, engaging in our program. It's just been a great experience, and I'm so thankful for all the work that you're doing with children and families in the community. It's truly invaluable work, and we're really thankful to have had the opportunity to engage with you as we all work toward having safer communities where we prevent and end sexual violence. See?
Thank you, everybody.